What's up, guys? Welcome back to my basement. Toolbox, Burt Reynolds, pocket full of bubble wrap. So, the other day we talked about slider frames and how we can polish and quote unquote modify some of the components inside a slider frame to potentially reduce friction and, along with that, potentially make a smoother pull in a slider frame. And we talked about kind of how the different parts work together and what polishing certain parts actually does to help reduce friction or help it have a smoother feel to it. So today I received a part that I've been waiting on for a project that I've been working on, and it happens to be a slider frame, so I figured why not make a video about what I'm going to do in this slider frame. So this is a autococker parts. It looks brown in that light. It's not. It's dust black. I just have a yellow light up there. This is a slider frame from autocockerparts.com. I picked this one up used. I hadn't gotten a chance to really check out any of the stuff that they've been putting out, and I have to say that I'm pretty happy with it. They do have a nice quality to them. This one is a pre-99 spec frame, so it does take a pre-99 trigger plate. The trigger plate supplied with it is rather nice. It has a nice wide plate to it. So that's one thing I wanted to cover here real quick. One thing that you will see, depending on when you're hunting around for slider plate or slider frame internals, is there's going to be different trigger plates available. One of the things that makes a big difference in the feel, and again, this is something that everyone has their own preference for, is the trigger plate itself. So, here's our good old crusty trigger plate from when we were talking about the internals of said slider frame. And this is the trigger plate from Autococker Parts, I believe. I'm not sure if they're going by Gap products or Autococker Parts nowadays. So, one of the things that makes a big difference here is going to be the thickness of the plate. So if you look, you can see the crusty plate here on the left is probably 3/4 of the width of the plate on the right. Now what does that mean as far as the feel in the frame? Well, if we take this plate, drop it into the frame, as you can see, there's quite a bit of side-to-side play here, which some guys like, some guys don't. It doesn't really bother me, per se. My biggest thing has always been smoothness of the pull. I'm not super worried about side-to-side play. In fact, I find it a little more, it makes a little more relaxed trigger pull, in my opinion. So, if we take the other plate and drop it in, this one is obviously, considering they were made by the same company, this one has been matched to the specs, to the internal size of the slot in the trigger frame. So as we can see, we have almost zero side-to-side slop, which is going to provide a good, steady, solid pull here. So there's not going to be any slop side-to-side. Now, like I said, this is one of those things that when you're learning about parts and what parts feel different in different frames and whatnot, when you get into changing around guts and frames, this is something that you're probably going to have some experiences where you're going to buy stuff and it's not going to be the correct thing, or it's not going to fit in the frame. A lot of it is, this is where you start to really develop your own personal preference. Some of these plates, you may buy an aftermarket plate that's supposed to be the best thing in the world and throw it into a frame and realize that you just flat out don't like that. I mean, like I've said a bunch of times before in these videos, fact is, there is no one perfect way to set these up. That's the whole beauty of these markers, is these are tinker toys for big kids. I mean, we can do anything you want with this marker. So, what I'm going to do is, I've already gutted this frame, obviously. Have everything out of it. We have our spring, our pin, we have the return spring, we have the sear spring, we have the sear, we have the trigger plate, and then I do have the set screws, the adjustment set screws in here. So what I just wanted to run over real quick is kind of a polishing procedure, and it's really, really simple, guys. It's exactly what it sounds like. So in this trigger frame, we're going to have this nice little roller sear right here. So what we're going to do is address the back end of this sear first. As you can see, I started taking a little bit of meat off of it. And this particular one seems to be responding really well to a relatively high grit paper. So I'm going to start, instead of being at 400, I'm going to start at 600 grit. So again, always make sure to have a good assortment of paper around. Pretty much I run everything from 80 grit all the way to 1500, 2000 grit. It just depends on what you're messing with at the time. So in this particular part, what I usually will do, I have a little flat space here on my tech mat, and I like that the mat has a little bit of give to it. So I will take my paper, place it down on there. Typically what I will do is kind of notch my finger into the front of the sear there and try to match that angle. And we're just going to slip this back and forth. Now it's not just a straight back and forward motion when I do these. Typically what I will do is kind of rock it a little bit so that you're making sure the whole face surface here is being addressed while you're polishing this. So we're just going to work this a little bit on some 600, and this is where the video gets really, really boring. I guess most of the videos are kind of like that. It's just some random guy talking about crap in his basement with a half-naked Burt Reynolds in the back. So, whatever gets your rocks off, I guess. So what we're going to do, just work this back and forth. Obviously, you're working with steel here, so it's going to have a bit of resistance. It's a hard metal. This isn't brass or aluminum. On occasion, what I will do when you're working with higher grit paper, the higher the grit, the heavier the scratching is going to be. And what I mean by that is what the way grit actually works when they talk about 200, 400, 600, whatever. That is grit per square centimeter, square inch. I think it's a square inch. I don't remember. Anyway, obviously the higher the grit, the finer the abrasive is. Okay, so you're going to have more particles per square determining area, which leads to a higher grit. So it's going to leave heavier or lighter scratches. So on occasion, what I'll do, jump from your 600 to a piece of 1500, and what that will do for you is clean up the polish real quick and show you where, if anywhere, you have any heavy rough points. Okay? So all we're doing is layering finer scratches over the top, so anything that can be affected by that particular sandpaper is going to smooth that out, and then you can see where you still need to touch up a little bit. So in this case, I'd already been working on this a little bit, so we were already pretty close. So we're going to go ahead and jump from the 600 to the 1500. And honestly, especially for a finish sanding run, I like to keep a couple pieces of relatively well used paper around, because as the metal fills in between the particles of grit on the paper, if you think about it, it's going to be somewhat filling up that grit, which means you have less and less contact every time. So you'll be able to get a slightly finer sand out of a used piece of paper. Some of the edges have already been knocked down on the grit, some of the grit has filled in. So if you're looking for a really, really fine polish, you can get a little bit finer polish out of a used piece of paper. So one of the things that I usually look for is, I guess actually more of a feel for, is as you are sanding, if you think about it, and it applies for all the parts, the smoother the part is, the less friction you're going to have while working with this part. So obviously if I slap this piece down on a piece of 80 grit, I'm going to have a massive amount of friction. It's going to be a real pain to work around. As you polish this part, and you'll notice it especially on the higher grits, as you polish that part, that friction is going to lessen every time that you bring it to a higher grade of polish. So when you get to your 1500, you will start to feel it be smoother without even having to put it in the frame. And that will kind of be a notification for you to take a step back, take a look at how much you've worked it over, and go from there. One of the things you want to be careful of when you are sanding on stuff is obviously this has squared off edges for a reason in different places. You don't want to be necessarily rounding the top of it or the sides of it. It's not going to hurt anything massively, but it's just kind of a point of pride and a point of caution. So I'm not going to take you through the whole thing because I'm trying not to do another half-hour video. Sorry. But what we're going to do next is run the sides of this, because I've run this up to 1500 already. So we're going to go back to our 600. And when I'm doing a big piece of steel, relatively speaking, anytime I'm doing a large surface area, I'll usually run it in a circle. So that's what we're doing now. And you can see just in 30 seconds or so, if we look, I don't know if my camera is going to focus in well enough to see. This is the unpolished side. This side is completely untouched. Whereas if we flip to the other side, you can see how we're already starting to affect the sheen of the metal. So we're going to reach a higher polish there. So that's what we're going to do with that. Essentially what I'm going to be looking for is taking out most, or the majority of the pitting and any machining marks that are there. Again, being that this is one of the first times that I've messed with any of the Autococker parts products, at least to my knowledge, I'm actually pretty impressed. The bearing feels really nice. The steel looks pretty good. There's not machining marks running around all over the place. It's decent quality stuff. We're going to do similar things on the plate itself. Now, when it comes down to it, the trigger plate itself has far more friction surfaces than the sear does. You're only talking a couple friction surfaces on the sear, whereas you're talking, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 to 8, depending on if you want to detail on the points up here, but roughly 6 different friction surfaces available on the trigger plates. So typically this is where I will put most of my focus in, is on the plate itself. So there are basically the same processes. As you can see, this trigger has been used a little bit. Let's see if I can get a good angle on it. You can kind of see how there's some wear on this lower portion, as well as some wear on this portion, and there is some wear on the sear ramp right here as well. So those are already showing within the short life of this trigger plate. Those are showing you your friction areas. Same thing, you can kind of see, it might be a little tougher to see, right in here. See, now, like I was talking about in the slide frame video, this is also a friction surface. This is going to be rubbing against the top of your, or the bottom of your body, and you have to realize that you're not just working against a piece of aluminum there, but you also have, you also are going to have the valve set screw, which is going to be in there. So you have the potential, if that valve set screw backs out or if you don't have it set in far enough, you have the potential to be rubbing against steel with this as well. So this is an important surface. As you can see, and obviously there's nothing against this particular product because it's extremely common, I mean, across the board with pretty much everyone's plates out there. And let's face it, if everyone took the time to sit down and polish the living crap out of their plates before they ever left the manufacturer, there would be massive lead times that we'd never get our stuff. So as you can see, maybe, there you go, there's a little bit of roughness from the machining marks up here on the top. Still a really good looking plate. It does have a nice finish to it, but if I drag my fingernail across that, I can feel those ridges. Now, you're going to feel that if we adjust this up tight against the bottom of our body, there's potential for me to feel every one of these ridges as I'm pulling, as well as these ridges, because there are a little bit of machining marks in here. I'm not going to get a good shot of that, but there's a little bit of machining marks here on the ramp itself. These are all potential friction surfaces, as we talked about, and those are areas that we're going to be feeling when we pull the trigger. So, just like I had showed you on the sear, and when we talked about in the video, I'm going to do the back, which we've already done to about a 1500 grit. I'm probably going to take a little bit more time on that. I'm going to do both of the sides as well, and then on the trigger plate, I'm going to go into all of these nooks and crannies down in here. The bottom surface is here, the bottom surface is here, the top surface, as well as both the sides. Now, one thing I did want to show you, because I didn't happen to have it on hand at the time that I was making the video for the side frames, but bolted down, not bolted down, but clamped down here to my bench. This is just a little chunk of 1/4-inch bar stock. This is actually a part out of a double indexing vise that was being used in a cheap enough process that I really didn't care if I yanked it out. So I stole it out, and this is typically what I will use to do kind of the detail work on the inside of my plates. So with this, just like I talked about before in the video, just kind of wrap that paper around, and then what I have down here, where you can't see it, is a big ass clamp. It's a big clamp, not a big ass clamp. I don't know what the hell an ass clamp is, but so what I will do is just take that, clamp it down to the bench, and that gives you a nice template, or a jig, more like, so that, I'm going to get a good angle so you can see here, so that I don't have to try to make these angles by hand. Okay, I can just use this jig to run all of these angles without having to sit with this in my hand and trying to keep a piece of paper pinned up against it and sanding all of this and getting off level and whatnot. So I highly recommend, find yourself a little chunk of bar stock or something, build yourself a nice little jig. It will come in handy, and once you've done a couple of these by hand and spent several hours doing them, you'll thank yourself for making the correct tooling. So I'm probably going to go ahead and polish a bunch of this stuff out, and then I may recap later in the video, and we'll just kind of see how it goes from there. So thanks guys, maybe I'll see you in a minute.